Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is our, I think it's our 7th installment of the Compass series, the HTM Speaker Series. So my name is Sonia Gracci. I'm the director of the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research at Ryerson University. And before we begin, I would like to start with our traditional land acknowledgement and acknowledge the land upon which we sit at Ryerson. Obviously, we are not all sitting at Ryerson. None of us are sitting at Ryerson currently because we are on lockdown. But I would like to begin with our traditional acknowledgement for our university. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So again, thank you, everybody, for joining today. I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction about the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research here at Ryerson. So our mission is to facilitate and conduct research of both scholarly value and significance to the tourism and hospitality field. The Institute was established in 2009 as the research arm of the Ted Rogers School of Hospitality and Tourism Management. So a lot of what we do is we work with the tourism industry to provide practical-based research. But we also try to ensure that our students have the ability to work on industry-related and academic research. Our affiliates conduct research on a number of topics, including destination management, sustainability, Indigenous tourism, and visiting friends and relatives. And you can see some of us on here. Tom Griffin is the assistant director of the Institute. Brian Ryback is our communications associate at the Institute, and really the mastermind behind a number of the initiatives that we've been doing here over the last few months. So Compass is our speaker series, and it's one of the things that we've been working on since, well, we had it in person, but since COVID started, kind of like with Anne and Tamara on the ISO chats, we took it online. And so I think we may continue this format, although it was really nice to have it in person as well. The other thing that we've been doing is a podcast called Behind the Study, and that's Brian's podcast. Each episode features a different researcher and explores their unique background and career path. So we're on season 2. So if you haven't listened to season 1, it is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. And it really showcases a number of different researchers. And no, you haven't done one yet. But it showcases a number of our different researchers and also a number of different industry that we work with. So we have Shannon Guillen from the Travel Corps and Kelly Golaski, who used to be with Planetara. They've all done they've all done podcasts. You can find this information all on our website at HTMResearch.ca. And we also have a number of blogs that have been written by our students, really reflecting on how research has impacted them. So there's a lot of really interesting reads on there. So now I'm going to introduce our fabulous speaker. So of course, I'm very excited because Anne is a very good friend of mine, and we were just talking about the fact that I actually was supposed to be in Tasmania now because I was supposed to be on sabbatical in Tasmania and also with Tamara Newcastle, but I'm here in King, Ontario. And so I'm really happy that at least I get to see Anne talk about her amazing work on our speaker series. So Anne is an associate professor and a researcher with a keen interest in tourist behavior and sustainable tourism, and is based at the University of Tasmania in the School of Social Sciences. Some of Anne's most well-known research is the multiple award-winning project Tourism Tracer. But before I talk about Tourism Tracer, I always tell the story about Anne. because we met in Coolangatta at the coffee conference in 2014, and I liked her shoes. She had Miss Moose on. I can't remember what I ate like an hour ago, but I remember what Anne was wearing that day. And when I found out that she actually was the Hardy from Hardy and Beaton, who wrote about stakeholder theory in the Daintree, I got really excited because that was one of the top 3 journal articles that really impacted my own PhD research. So yes, Anne is very famous for Tourism Tracer, but to me, Anne will always be very famous for her work on stakeholder theory in the Daintree. So, but she's not, she's talking about Tourism Tracer today. So Tracer was the first project to track tourists with their consent for the duration of their holiday throughout entire destinations. Tourism Tracer's success resulted in changes in the way that destinations such as Tasmania collect visitor information. I also actually remember at coffee you having these discussions about Tracer with Bob McKercher and stuff. I should have got in on it then. Anne also co-directs the Tourism Research and Education Network, also known as TREND. In 2020, TREND, in conjunction with the University of Newcastle, initiated the highly successful ISOChat series. This series was dedicated to sharing the work of tourism researchers across the globe during the COVID pandemic on a weekly basis. It rapidly gained a reputation of being a collaborative, social, and supportive space for new, emerging, and experienced researchers from around the world. And I was part of ISOChats and was very excited to be there. So lots of things about Anne I could share with you. One, the lady goes swimming in the ocean no matter what temperature it is every single day, which I think is really amazing. A few years ago, we were all in Ibiza and she was swimming in that ocean every day, no matter how late we all went to bed. So it is without further ado, I'm sure we're all very excited to hear Anne talk about Tourism Tracer today. So welcome, Anne. Thank you for joining us at Compass.
Thanks, Sonia, and thank you very much for hosting me. Thanks to yourself and to Brian, to Frederick, and hello to Tom and a few other lovely familiar faces from Ryerson. I'm super excited. I'm almost overexcited about this seminar. Probably it must have been about 4 years ago. I went over and was kindly hosted by Ryerson for a short period of time. I was able to escape the kids and be a visiting scholar at Ryerson University. So I wish I was back in Toronto, but the second best thing is to be talking with you. So thank you very much for hosting me. Before I pull up my slides, I just want to also make an acknowledgement of country, and I'll tell you a little bit about where I come from later in a minute, but I'm from Tasmania, and that's called Lutruwita. And I just want to pay my respects to the traditional landowners of the land upon which I am based today. They're the Muwinina people, and in particular, I want to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and also emerging. So I'm going to bring up my slides, and we shall get started. I'll just have to flip them around, I think. Or does that look okay to you? You're not seeing speaker view? Cool. Okay, excellent. All right, so let's get started. I should just bring up a couple of things here and get ready, and then we can go. So today I'm going to be talking to you about technology, tourism, and COVID, and the potentials and pitfalls of using tech to assist with the impacts of COVID. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself first. So I'm joining you from right down the bottom of the world. Sometimes Australians call it the arse end of the world, down in Tasmania. It's a little island down the southern tip of Australia. It's sort of straight across from the South Island of New Zealand, and around about 60% of the island is a protected area in some form or another. So a lot of natural beauty within the island, and I live in Hobart, which is right down the south. Tasmania we have a university, just the one university here, and that's where I'm located. Tasmania's got 4 major entry points that tourists arrive into. We have, prior to COVID, we had around 1.3 or 4 million visitors arriving into the state each year through the 3 entry points. The major airports were down in Hobart, Launceston, and also in Devonport. And we also have a boat that travels between Tasmania and Melbourne in the southern end of Australia. And that's a passenger ferry. So around about 2.6 million passengers will come in on planes into the state each year, and about 500,000 passengers on the Spirit. But in terms of tourists, we get about 1.3 million. So it's a fairly small island. Because we are an island off an island, we basically have a moat around our island. So this, believe it or not, was actually on the front page of the Mercury. You can see in, which is our newspaper, you can see just under the word Mercury, it's dated March the 20th, 2020. And this was a statement by our Premier in relation to COVID. We've got a moat and we're not afraid to use it. So what happened during COVID last year was around about the 15th of March, Australia closed its borders really, really hard. So hard that you can barely leave the country or enter the country unless you're under extremely strict, terrible circumstances. And even then, it's about 2 weeks to be able to mobilise to leave. So this extremely hard Australian border was also mimicked by Tasmania. So if tourists or returning Australians during COVID came into Australia, they have to quarantine for 2 weeks upon arrival in Sydney or Melbourne or a couple of the other major ports. And then they used to have to quarantine once again for 2 weeks just because they'd passed through Melbourne or Sydney Airport when they came into Tasmania. So the end result of this extremely hard border closure was that we have had no COVID cases since last May. It's over 300 days. We feel really blessed to have that, but we also have a very strong sense of sort of like survivor syndrome. So I just want to pay my thoughts to people who are in lockdown at the moment. We are acutely aware that we are a tiny little island that's effectively stranded. The end result is that we have no COVID, but we know that there's a lot of pain around from people suffering. So I just want to pay my respects in terms of that as well. In terms of my research, islands have advantages, and I'll talk about that later on because it means that it's very easy to talk to people when they arrive in the island because you have these major entry points, so you can actually do some terrific research down in this small island when there are tourists. So just a little bit about myself. As Sonia mentioned, I started my research with a strong interest in issues around sustainability and particularly the impact that tourism has on communities. And I did that research up in the Daintree. And then when I returned, sort of continued on with research, I changed tack a little bit and I became really, really interested in tourist behaviour. So I spent a lot of time chasing big RVs and caravans and motorhomes around the highways of North America and UK and in Australia, in Tasmania and on the mainland. And then as time went on, and just about around the time that I met Sonia and Frederick and Tom and was over at Ryerson, something began to really bug me. And that was that despite, the fact we're on this island and we can, talk to people as soon as they arrive, it's only a dribble of people relative to the rest of the country with 1.3 million visitors, we don't actually know where they go. We can ask them, but they often can't remember where they've been, particularly, when you're in a new place. And if you weren't the driver and you weren't responsible for navigation, you often don't remember. So that's when I kind of started getting an interest in technology and the way that we can use technology to understand where tourists go. My other research, I'm really strongly committed. I guess that the final photo on the far side with One Planet is that Tourism Tracer has been on what some might regard a bit of a dream ride. So there was a lot of interest in it from overseas, and it's now a research partner of the One Planet Network, which is the sustainable tourism of the United Nations World Tourism Organization. I'm also a strongly committed Tasmanian. I am born and bred in Tasmania. Many of Australians love to laugh about Tasmanians, and they say that we're all related because we're a little bit inbred. Well, I'm hoping that I'm not. But what I do love about Tassie, having grown up and with parents who worked in the tourism industry, is that I just love doing research that kind of has an impact on the community. Now, 5 years ago in Australia, that was considered not so good because Australia was really focused on outputs and publications, but now their tack has changed and the universities are often really interested in research that has an impact. So Tracer came at a time, it was lucky, the timing of Tracer, I guess, in that, you know, it did have a big impact, and I'll talk about it later on, because the other thing that I realize is that no research is perfect. Every research has its problems, and my goodness, Tracer has some problems, and I'll talk to you about that as well. So the other thing I'm very excited about is that a lot of this talk is based on a book that I just released. Just a few weeks ago, this book came out. And a lot of what I'm talking about today comes from the book, where I review all the different tracking methods and think about what can they do for tourism research, what can they do for the industry, what are the implications ethically of using these types of research, because I'm acutely aware that, you know, tracking is kind of like a bit of a dirty word. So we're going to talk about that as we go through today. Just before I start though, you know, technology and COVID as well as that sort of impact agenda that I talked about with Tracer. The other thing that's happened in the last year that sort of helped many of us who do research in tech is that we have really realized the role that technology can play during COVID. And I'm just talking about one tiny little aspect, which is tracking, that there are many other things that technology has been able to demonstrate its relevance in helping COVID in the last 12 months. One of them is, you know, in our sphere, where majority of us in this room are probably academics. So it's been great for connections. So the ISO chats, you know, forum that we held, and Sonia was a speaker, and now I'm a speaker here. And, you know, that's been great to bring our academy together, I guess, and to be able to share research. It's not always good. We sometimes get Zoom bombed. This is where Brent Ritchie had a spectacular Zoom bomb in the middle of the ISO chats that we held. Hopefully we won't have it today, but we had some fantastic it was a fantastic Zoom bomb. They even took control of his slides. So hopefully it won't happen today. But it's been great to bring us together. Technology's also allowed the tourism industries to stay connected. I'm a board member of the Destination Southern Tasmania, which is a group of tourism operators and the role of Destination Southern Tas is to help market and manage the supply side of tourism in Tasmania. And technology has been able to bring the industry together to stay connected. It's also been able to facilitate things that have helped the industry survive while it's in this pause. Even in Tasmania, we've had a pause because we were so reliant on tourists coming into our island from Australia or overseas. So we've seen sort of this proliferation of things like bartering apps and, you know, network pages in South Hobart, near where I live, the Good Karma network, where people sort of giving things away and swapping things. Bartering apps have become really, really popular. And so we can see that technology has, you know, demonstrated its role to some extent. And also the fantastic work of Ais Tusiadir and her work in, you know, robots and artificial intelligence. COVID has really exacerbated the need for things like low touch and no touch technology, and it's been able to help. But as I mentioned before, what I'm going to be talking about today is how technology can be used to actually understand the movement of tourists. Right back at the very beginning, when the COVID outbreak began, one of our speakers in ISO Chats, Dr. Alison Anderson, referred to the WHO and how they mentioned that the situation had created an infodemic because so much data was released from tech providers to try and understand the impacts of COVID, particularly because so many traditional data sources had collapsed. So in Tasmania, for example, we've been running the Tasmania Visitor Survey since 1978. We have this incredible longitudinal database, or the government does. Uh, um, and suddenly, because there were no tourists arriving, they no longer were able to intercept people upon arrival or departure on our island. And so they couldn't get any information. So tourists became Tasmanians, and they'd never tracked or surveyed them before. So, we really understood our reliance on traditional data sources and how technology could help when COVID broke out. So to some extent, I think the pandemic has really acted as a catalyst that has highlighted the potentials and also the pitfalls and the attitudes of people towards technology to track tourists. And incredibly, I think, while we traditionally have relied on a handful of methods, so, we think about, we do interviews, we observe people, we conduct surveys, we use secondary data sources to understand how tourists travel. Technology has actually been the catalyst for what I think is at least 6 different methods. So technology has scrambled and really increased our methodological toolbox that we have that we can use to understand how tourists travel. So, there's social media tracking that involves IT methods. There's mobile phone tracking that involves sort of IT and big data methods. We've got GPS tracking that requires GIS skills. So all these different technologies have actually meant that the Academy is suddenly faced with many, many methods that we didn't use before, and in a very, very short period of time. And consequently, I think we often tend to think of them as the same thing, just like tech, tracking, bad. But it's not always the case, and sometimes it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a fast and furious review of some different methods that we can actually use to track tourists, culminating obviously in my favourite, because I'm slightly biased, which is Tourism Tracer. But I'll also talk about the warts and all of that. The main thing is I'm not going to focus too heavily on the legislation and the laws that oversee what needs to be done in terms of making sure that this type of research is ethical. But I need to note that overriding, my approach and my assessment of the ethical implications of these different techniques is the General Data Protection Regulations, the GDPR, from the European Union, that's had an enormous influence on how we do research, not just in technology, and it goes beyond that. But basically, the requirement from the GDPR for tourists, for people to understand how their data is used, and also to opt in to having their data being used, has been a game changer for technology, in my mind, for the better. So let's have a look at one of the first methods, which is social media. So social media data, when we're talking about tracking tourists, it was what I refer to as non-continuous data. So what, as we know, when we use social media, we might do a post. I'll see, I think it's at the next one. We do a post. These are my 2 little doggies at up the east coast on Tassie, on one of my favourite beaches. It's a secret because Tasmanians are obsessed with having their own secret beach. So I could tell you, but I'd have to blindfold you before I took you. But you can see in this post that I've got a geotagged location. So behind the Facebook technology is GPS technology that identifies where the user is, and we have the option when we use social media to put a geotag in. So what we can do as researchers is we can actually look at that and we can collate it. We can collate the geotagged posts, and we can do that either by accessing the data through an API, which is kind of like a funnel that you often will buy from the social media company. You can do that from Twitter, for example, or you can do it manually. What we can't do as researchers anymore is scrape data. Most social media companies have banned automated scraping, where you actually go through and scrape up automatically using programs. You scrape up the locations to understand where people are. So this type of analysis is really useful because it can show you where people are going and where crowding occurs. However, it's often sort of seen in poor taste because of people's privacy, issues around privacy. The thing that is interesting is, from my mind, is that there's a lot of our apps on our phones actually track us without us realizing. So I'm going to get us to do a little exercise. So what I want you to do is grab your mobile phone, and I'm quite happy for you to all look down. So if you have an Apple phone, I want you to go into settings and then privacy and then location services. If you're an Android user, you're going to look at an app one by one. So if you choose the, go into your settings and then choose the app that you're interested in, and then look at app permissions. So on Apple phones, I'm going to do it through my Apple phone, and I will show you what I can find. That's going to tell me which of my social media platforms are actually tracking me. So let's have, has anybody managed to get through yet? And would they like to pop into the chat box what you're finding? I'm just going to go in settings, privacy, location services, and apps that track. So if I look down here on my phone, you can see they're all the apps that I have, and they are the apps that are actually tracking where I go all the time. So there's a couple, there is ABC News, Airbnb while using, Emirates, what a shame, won't be flying them for a while using. Facebook, never. I've decided to opt out of that. But I wonder if any of us are surprised by how much we are actually being tracked for our location services. So please pop in the chat box if you are, so many of you have got them while using. So I'd like to see in the chat box, were there any surprises? Was anyone surprised by apps that they didn't realize were actually tracking them? Please pop that into the chat box. So what the problem is with social media tracking is that we're finding that, and Kozinets has written about this. Let me go back. I'm just going to go on to the next slide. Is that Robert Kozinets has written about the fact, oops, now I'm going to get, there we go. Let me go forward. Kozinets has written that a significant number of people, very likely a majority, would prefer that researchers should not use their social media data and information in their investigations. So that what it's argued is that, so we've got people saying Pokemon Go. Effie said that she's quite surprised. S. Rodriguez has said no surprises, I've gone in and chosen. So there's quite a lot of there's quite a spectrum of users. Some people realise they are being tracked and are happy to have their data used. Some people realise they are being tracked but don't like the idea that their data is actually being used by researchers, or in the case of Facebook organisations. So you've got this big spectrum of consent that exists, and that's where it becomes really, really muddy. When you're doing research like this, it's argued that if you're on Instagram, for example, and you can see that a user has put in an @ or a hashtag, that can be regarded as an attempt to be public. And therefore you can say, okay, well, I think that particular person would be happy to have their, if they have a non-private account, they would be happy to have their social media data used for research. But the thing is, how do we actually know if Anne Hardy on Instagram, has a public account and does lots of hashtags, how do we know that Anne Hardy is actually an adult? What if Anne Hardy is actually a child? So there's a bit of muddiness in the ethics of using social media. So there's also a risk that if Anne Hardy posts publicly and then suddenly she changes all her posts to be private, but before that a researcher has scraped the data and used it, or got the API or done it manually, how do we know whether it's actually ethical? So there's a little bit of muddiness about using this data. So you have to be very, very cautious. But of the research that has been done, and I'm just going to look at that. So of the research that's been done, we have actually found some really interesting insights that's come out of it. And when you're collecting vast amounts of data, that's when obviously things are less identifiable, but you can still go back and identify these people. So on the left-hand side with this picture of the Taj Mahal, this group of researchers actually ranked the top 20 worldwide tourist sites and their attractiveness. So they found the top 3 of the Taj Mahal, the Pisa Tower and the Eiffel Tower, and they used Twitter to actually get this data. So Twitter allows you to use an API, which is like a funnel, to access data. And they were able to look at where people were coming from and going to. So this is how you can use social media data. You can also use social media data to understand user flows. So on the right-hand side, we have some research by Chua et al. In 2016, and they used geotag Twitter data to assess user flows in Italy. And what they could see was that they were able to trace people's movements when they were geotagging, and the pathways reveals the sequence of movement from one location to the next. And they found that the majority of tourists were travelling in a south to southeasterly direction, largely down the coastal areas. It also revealed some really stark differences between domestic and international travellers. So this type of research can be really useful for doing that. The problem with social media, it's great because you've got vast amounts of data at low cost, and you can understand those look at those geotags and their timestamps, so you can understand sequential movement. But of course, we can only use the data that they've actually tagged at the time. So I might tag here, and then I might tag in 1 week's time in Melbourne. No one knows where I've been beforehand. How did I get to Melbourne? Why did I leave Tasmania? Those types of things, you can't access the data. That said, because social media data is so vast and there's so much of it, we can use it as a proxy for understanding volume and accommodation. It's good to understand preferences, but as I mentioned before, it's reliant on, it doesn't produce continuous data. It doesn't come with socio-demographics. We need to have mobile phone coverage. In Tasmania, that's not a given. And it's really difficult to differentiate between tourists and locals and business owners. We also know, of course, with social media that there are biases within platforms. So, different platforms have a different type of user. So, I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook, or less so as time goes on. And it's a very different type of user. So you have to sort of take it with a grain of salt. And as I mentioned before, there are issues around ethics and consent, and researchers have to always stay on top of the terms and conditions of websites because they're constantly changing. But research such as this during COVID is really, really useful, particularly as tourism starts up again, because COVID has been such a game changer. We're all traveling in different ways. And in different time frames as well. So it's really good for understanding visitor flows, crowding, how people actually disperse. And in doing so, research such as this may be able to sort of alleviate community concerns to some extent, because if you know where people are posting in almost real time, should an outbreak occur, you sort of know where many people are. It's been argued that Twitter can actually be used, I'm amazed by this, as an actual proxy for actual visitation. I'm going to look at another type, which is mobile phone data tracking now. So we've all got our mobile phones, and we know that mobile phones are designed to send text messages and receive phone calls. And so when that happens, a little message goes up to the towers, and researchers can actually, when a phone call is made, the internet's accessed, or a text message is sent, researchers can actually access this data from phone companies. Very difficult in Australia, but it has been done elsewhere. And this results in vast amounts of data. We're talking about researchers last year, Zhao, Wang and Fang, they got 600 to 800 million records per day from Shanghai. So they had a data set of over 10 billion phone trajectories. So vast amounts of data. And this is called passive positioning. So you can actually see where the person is when they use their mobile phone. Recently, there were stories on this, and that was in the story on CNN recently on how Venice is actually using this data to understand where crowding is occurring. And what they do is they combine it with CCTV, and they can see the tourism patterns that are occurring at the time. Again, under the GDPR, one must be very careful to ensure that this data is used correctly, and that you're only using data where people have actually consented to have their data used. And whilst the information is not collected on particular people's identities, we can't always be sure that it's 100% anonymous. But there's been some amazing research come out that's used this data, particularly from Estonia, from the Chart 2 Mobility Institute. So Round and Al looked, and they looked at how the different countries that were visited by tourists, when the trips were made, the trip duration, and they were able to understand the relationship and build theory around the home location and different travel patterns. They also were able to look, the same group led by Ahas this time in 2007, were able to understand how tourists use different spaces across the seasons. And that same group also looked at event goers, and found that event tourists came from closer locations than regular tourists, and that therefore you could use the distance decay principle in events. So mobile phone tracking is really great because we all have it. The data is very reliable. It's enormous. If you can get it from your phone company, it's cheap, and obviously it can be used as a proxy for visitation. It's great for understanding where people are, and you can also access information on their home location, so if they're international or domestic. But that's about it. You can't really get very much more information. You can track the movement of phones from tower to tower, individual phones from tower to tower, so you can understand how they move around. But it's not continuous, because if you're not using your phone, and I think about when I travel overseas, I very, very rarely use my phone for text or phone calls. It's non-continuous data. So again, you don't really understand where people are going. And we also have to be careful that, particularly in Australia, we only have a few mobile phone companies, and they're very different in what they offer. They have very different client bases. So just being sure that you understand, who your database of users are when you're making inferences on how people actually travel. So they can't really answer questions on, previous travel history, motivation for travel, or their preferences, and the data is limited to where cell towers are. And as I mentioned before, in Australia, in Tasmania, we have 60% of the state's protected areas. There's very few cell towers around. It's the same with, I'm sure, in northern Canada and other locations. So just sort of bearing that in mind is important. The major thing about this type of research is consent, again, that anonymized data is argued not always to be anonymous. So there was research that was done that said they only needed 4 points, space-time points, to identify 95% of individuals. So you can actually get the unique number that is attached to a mobile phone, and researchers have realised that they can actually work out who these people are. So it's a form of research that has to be treated with caution, but it can be very useful. And again, the GDPR, you can only use data where people have actually provided their consent and opted in. It's been argued that location data is, part of an extension of the surveillance state. And the history of surveillance says that once it's rolled out, it's often hard to roll it back. And so that's what some people are worried about. And location data is not always representative and can exacerbate inequalities. So, children, the homeless, the elderly, non-adopters, those without financial means will be left out of the analysis. But for COVID, it's been really useful because as people return, we can see where these clusters of people are actually located. And that can be really useful because we're talking about very different travel patterns. I'm going to quickly look at one more technique, and then we will look at apps. And that final technique is one that we have become very familiar with during COVID, and that is Bluetooth tracking. It's also very similar to Wi-Fi tracking. So what this form of tourist tracking actually does, it's a form of big data, and each phone has a MAC address, which is a media access control address, and they can be picked up by Bluetooth scanners from around 20 meters away. And Wi-Fi scanners from even further away. Bluetooth scanners, such as one in the photo, you only need to be around the scanner for a few seconds. It will pick your phone up if Bluetooth is enabled and if you're not connected to something like your car, for example. So in Tasmania, in the main street in Hobart, our traffic lights are actually run using Bluetooth scanners. So they look at the traffic coming through and the flows, and they can automatically adjust the lights according to the flow of cars. So it's good because it only needs to scan for a couple of seconds. So it's good for fast moving objects. Wi-Fi is a little bit different. People need to be in the range of the scanner for around a minute. So it's much better for sort of pedestrian flows and shopping malls. So what this data can do is it can scan phones as they pass these little black boxes, and it's produced some really interesting data. In the Louvre, there was research that looked at how people moved through the Louvre, and what they were able to, they looked at sort of these 3 sites, and what they found was that despite people's different amounts of time in the Louvre, they always tried to hit the big spots. So the path sequences, as we call them, for both long and short stay visitors was actually very, very similar. So you can understand, it helps you understand how people are moving through places and where they're stopping and where they're not, and how much time they're spending in locations. Most of us have probably come across this form of tracking because of COVID and the COVID apps, which rely on Bluetooth technology. The phones in this case, in the technology that we've seen during COVID, talk to each other rather than to an actual scanner. And there was huge amounts of media on this, particular in the Asia Pacific region. There was an app that was developed in Singapore, and it's subsequently been used in many countries, including Australia and New Zealand. What the phones do is that they talk to each other, they swap unique addresses, and they do that if the phones are in contact with each other for more than a period of time. It started out as 15 minutes. It was very highly pushed by the government, but amongst us researchers who knew this technology, it was pretty much doomed to fail from the beginning, because the people are required to be close to each other for 15 minutes or more. So that means someone can just walk past you, sneeze on you, infect you and walk off, and you won't be actually traced. But the bigger issue around these apps is that iOS and Android have tightened up their rules around tracking. So if you put this app on an Apple phone, it would deactivate and stop working. The app would stop tracking and looking for other Bluetooth Bluetooth in other phones if your phone went to sleep. And that was a rule from iOS. They actually stop the tracking when the phone's not active. And so people were finding that the app just wasn't on. And I think they managed to track one COVID case in Australia through using this particular app. Now there's a tendency to use QR codes down here or just humans to do the contact tracing because our numbers are so low. So the COVID apps, unfortunately, haven't been a great success, and they've been a great example of the limitations of technology. There was a lot of discussion around whether it was a contravention of human rights, because while the phones just swapped their identifier number, it is possible for someone to actually identify a person by attaching that number to the holder of the phone. So Bluetooth and Wi-Fi tracking is contentious, but there are many good things around it. In terms of prior to COVID and prior to the COVID app, they're really great because you can get, if you do Bluetooth or Wi-Fi tracking, you can collect vast amounts of data. It's really cheap. It's good for large-scale tracking. You can see movement from place to place. And then you can understand the mobility of people without having to survey and rely on recall. But it's non-continuous. The Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth has to be turned on the user's phone for long enough for the scanner to pick it up. And so it only picks up phones, for example, with Bluetooth when they're in search mode and they're not already connected to another device. We don't know who we're talking to or who we're tracking. We don't know if these people are locals or tourists. There's been a lot of research around how to determine that using different algorithms. And of course, we don't know anything about these tourists why they are traveling. So this method, when we've used Bluetooth technology for COVID via an app, and when we're relying on apps talking to each other, it's pretty much been a miserable failure. But in terms of post-COVID and during COVID behaviour, if we use the phone talking to the little black box method, again, that can be really, really useful to understand how vast amounts of people are travelling through locations. So I've gone through quite a few different techniques. I'm now going to move forward. Excuse me, flipping through the slides because I know time is upon us. I'm going to look at bespoke apps. So you'll recall that when we've been talking, I've been talking a lot about how the fact that these apps, these techniques that I've covered are really, really great because they're often quite cheap and they result in vast amounts of data. But what they really can't tell us is why people are traveling, and many of the different methods don't tell us actually the continuous movement of people. And those things are the things that really bothered me and resulted in myself and a team of 8 other researchers, including Ulrich Gretzel and Bob McKercher. Ulrich spoke in the last series, and also largely a group of academics from the University of Tasmania to design this particular app. So what we did was we designed an app that could track people for the duration of their stay when they arrived in the state of Tasmania. The app had within it a survey, because what was bothering us as well was that we might be able to understand where people go through, Bluetooth tracking or Wi-Fi or mobile phones or social media, but we really didn't know anything about them. So we wanted to know if they're tourists, why they're in Tasmania, a bit about their past travel history to determine, what were the influences upon their decisions to travel to different places throughout our island state. We started in 2016, and as Sonia has mentioned, and also Frederick might remember, around the time when I met them and was in Ryerson, we were beginning to roll it out. And it was so scary because I was pretty much geared up for a miserable failure, because I thought, why would people ever say yes to being tracked? And we have to ask them because that is a requirement. But we pressed ahead. In the end, we designed this app that we put up on the iTunes store and also the Google Play Store. And at the beginning, we put the app on mobile phones, study phones, and we gave people a phone with the app on it. But as time went on, we just asked them to put an app on their own phone. And to our surprise, it actually worked. And some of the incentives were that for the early users, they got the use of data from the phone. But for the later users, they the ones currently, they get a cup of coffee upon leaving Tasmania. It's amazing, the currency of coffee, isn't it? And they also got this really nice map that showed them where they had travelled through the state, that had a bit of braggability to it. This is a particularly nice map, someone moving through our state, that they could share with their family and friends, to show them where they had been, because we realise that tourists like to kind of do that at the end when you get home. So the other thing we had to do was deal with the data. So we were getting two types of data from this app. We were getting GPS data, which is global positioning system data. So we're getting this continual data showing the latitude and longitude of where tourists were going. And we were also getting survey data that told us a lot about these particular tourists. So we developed a dashboard. So I'll show you about the data and what we got out of it. So this is kind of what the dashboard looks like. It's tourismtracer.com. And I'm going to show you a little video which will show you what we could see from this data and how we could filter it by their place of arrival, why they were in Tasmania, their motivations, their age, whether they'd been here before or not. And those types of things. So hopefully this data will work. And perhaps Sonia, if you could just wave furiously if it doesn't, or maybe Brian. Good. Is it okay? Right. Whoops. Let's not traumatize ourselves more with music, any more music. It's funny, isn't it? Because Tourism Tracer was an amazing project to be a part of, but my God, it was stressful. And it continues to be. And one day I'll give you another presentation on the pros and cons of commercialization. Tourism Tracer was sponsored by the state government of Tasmania and also the Tourism Industry Council, as well as a technology research partner called SenseT. And it has since been commercialised, and we have a non-exclusive license holder who collects the data, who can collect data as well using that technology. And it's been taken up by Tourism Tasmania, our state government body, and they are continuing to use it at the moment. They've been collecting data for a couple of years. We're still waiting on the dashboard to come out, but unfortunately, the terms of the license mean that we can't always access the data. That is a topic for another conversation around commercializations and the pitfalls of impacts, but we can sometimes access the data, which is great. But in the first instance, when we did the project, we were able to get this amazing data. So it showed us where people travel through the state. So we were able to determine itineraries. We were able to understand in this instance, we were looking at people driving up the east coast of Tasmania, and we could find that this was a really popular itinerary and that people were frequently entering one end of the state and coming out another end of leaving another end of the state. And as time has gone on, we've done research on this dispersal that I'll talk about later. And we've found that this is a way to really increase dispersal if we're encouraging people to come in and out of different gateways. We were able to look at this research and use it to understand how people moved through national parks. So this is a very popular national park called Ryerson. We could see that the average time people were spending at one of the lookouts was 13 minutes, that half of them then continued down to the edge of the beach, which was a bit of a surprise because we thought it was commonly thought that not as high as 47% of people went down to the beach. We could see how many people walked along the beach, halfway along the beach, because it gave us data down to 10 metres of accuracy. We could understand how people used crowded resources, such as the car park at Ryerson. This photo is taken from the other side. Ryerson has around 300,000 visitors a year, which is and fluctuates maybe a bit higher and a bit lower, and of course now it's very low. We were able to see that the average length of time people were parking in the car park was just under 2 hours. The peak arrival time was 11, and the peak departure time was about 2:20. And interestingly, we found that those who arrived in the peak times actually tended to stay longer. They stayed just short of 2.5 hours. And those people tended to be 60 plus or below 29. And the smaller groups stayed longer. So what the Tracer app can actually do is we can actually ping people at certain locations. So when we see them driving along the road in the bottom of this photo, there is the potential to actually send them a message because there's a geofence around that area that says, looks like you're driving to the car park. It's 11:30. We know from that app that that person is over 60, so they're likely to want to go there and they're likely to stay longer. How about you go and try another destination first? Go and have a look at the lighthouse. So there's the ability to actually redirect behaviour. And that's what we realised this app could actually do. We were able to look at road safety and determine that in Tasmania, it was commonly said that our Chinese visitors were driving faster. And now the Chinese visitors in the left of this graph are orange, and I can't see them driving the fastest. I can see the Hong Kong visitors actually driving a little bit faster in 60, 100 zones. And actually Chinese visitors have a little trouble keeping to the speed limit in lower zones around 60 kilometres an hour. But overall, we found that the speediest visitors, of course, were Australians, not from international visitors. So we could do some myth busting, which is quite fun. I did some research with Bob McKercher, and I'm sorry about my bad use of colours in the graph, but essentially what we can see here is this is a heritage town, and 12 till 2 p.m. is in the middle of the day. And in this heritage town, we expected to see lots of people who are in Tasmania for history and heritage, like the red bars. But actually you can see the larger bars are those who are in Tassie for food and beverage, and that town is well known for that. But also wilderness visitors were people who were primarily in Tassie for wilderness were in this heritage town late in the afternoon. So there's the potential for this data to help new business owners who might want to know what type of person is driving through the town what product should I offer and what time should I offer. So you can see, you know, the different motivation of visitors who have different motivations driving through at different times. We're also unable to understand dispersal. So the state of Tasmania has a strategy to increase dispersal. This was particularly dominant prior to COVID, and I'm sure it will be when the borders open up, because we want people going in and sharing their tourist dollars through the regions that are able to cater to them. So on the left-hand map of Tasmania, you can see that that's all the arrivals, and that's where they are dispersing and staying the night in the state. But if we just look at those who arrive in Hobart, the major port, we can see that they don't actually disperse very much. So from this data, we can sort of begin to realise that if you want to encourage dispersal, you need to encourage people to arrive in the different ports, because the dispersed visitors are actually arriving from the non-southern ports in Tasmania. We've also had a lot of fun recently with Martha, who's in the room, my fantastic PhD student, and Amit Birenboim, who works over in Israel, looking at new methods of measuring dispersal. We're running short on time, but basically the one down the bottom right-hand corner is the standard deviation ellipse, which is a way to actually measure the activity space. So where a tourist is actually traveling through time and space. So it looks at the spatial magnitude and also the directionality of dispersal. So through that paper, we were actually able to use a new technique to understand dispersal and understand the factors that were influencing dispersal in our state, which was length of stay, whether or not you're a repeat visitor, and whether those who entered and exited from different ports, they are the ones that tend to be dispersing further. So moving forward, that's probably something the state needs to consider in their marketing to get people to come in and use the different ports, not just Hobart. We've been able to look at the impact that bushfires have on people's travel patterns through a new incarnation of the app down in southern Tasmania. So the left-hand side is people's travel prior to the fires, and the right-hand side is travel following the bushfires. So we were able to sort of show that people are dispersing far less after the event. We've also been, up until COVID, which put a halt to it, we've been able to look at how cruise ship visitors disperse through locations. As you know, cruise ships are not without controversy, and this research project sought to understand whether domestic visitors who are orange, and particularly domestic cruise ship people who were actually from Sydney and arriving home, we were able to look at their dispersal through New South Wales. The blue lines are international visitors. So what we were able to show was that when a cruise ship comes into port and finishes the cruise, that international visitors are not dispersing so much through the state, which is a challenge for the industry, and it might sort of help them improve their reputation a little bit, because they're often thought of just sort of large amounts of people dumping on a small amount of space. So that project's paused obviously because of COVID. Martha, who's in the room at the moment, is my terrific PhD student, and she's doing a very exciting project at the moment using Tracer. So she's actually gamifying the front end of the app. She's using a couple of theories. One of them is self-determination theory to actually assist in the design of this super cool kind of like adventure style, choose your own adventure gamified front end of the app. And what we're going to try and do is see whether we can encourage tourists to disperse farther into regions by getting them to do quests to either find the largest tree or find different things related to their area of interest. This, I think, is a particularly exciting thing, because as people get more and more savvy with tech, they get more and more bored with tech as well. And the final project that I wanted to alert you from Tracer that we're working on is a wellbeing project where we're going to be tracking tourists' wellbeing through time and space as they go into Tasmania. This has been done with the Menzies Research Institute. We've just started it, and we're using psychological measures to assess tourists' wellbeing. So I'm really excited about this project. So the great thing about Tracer is that it provides us with continuous data. It's very, very accurate, down to 10 meters, and large amounts of data. We're tracking sort of around 500 to 1,000 tourists a year, but it's not big data by any means. I would call it bespoke data. We can sync the demographic and the GPS data together, and we can actually ask real-time questions. So, you know, what do you feel? How are you feeling now that you're in the national park? Or how do you, what's your we can measure well-being and those types of things. We've been able to sort of play with the design of the app so that the battery life, doesn't drain the phone, which is one of the most annoying things, as we all know, when we put a new app on our phone. But it's not without its problems. It can only work indoors. It is subject to noise, which is like fuzzy data when you're in high-rise buildings. It's getting better and better as time goes on. And it's really expensive because you have to recruit tourists. So in Tasmania, they've managed to cut the costs down because we have an island with only certain places that you can enter into. So Tourism Tasmania has placed ads, and they have this, the incentive is a coffee, and that seems to be actually attracting around 1,000 tourists a year. But new projects are really expensive to roll out, particularly things like wellbeing ones where we have to recruit people and encourage them to stay involved with the app over time. What we have found, and we have to have good recruitment techniques so people actually know they're being tracked. We can't lie about this. This is way too high risk. We need to be very clear about that. And of course, like any research, we're going to be subject to responder bias. So we have lots of different notifications at the start of the app to let people know what we're doing. Well, I think personally that this type of technology has huge potential for COVID. This is a car in Tasmania. We have a serious problem in our industry, not just in Tasmania, I would argue worldwide, and that's a reputational problem because tourism, when it begins, is going to be, and it was before, the vector of the disease. So this type of technology understands exactly where people are, and excuse the typo, and have been. We can send notifications to either tourists to alert them if they've been into towns that have COVID or cases have emerged. It can also be used to reassure community members because many of the communities that I'm seeing are arguing that they want to know where tourists are so they feel safe as it returns. So I feel like this type of technology has got potential into the future. The problem is with it, though, as I mentioned before, and I read this paper another day, a few days ago, and I absolutely love it. It's called the privacy, it talks about the privacy calculus, is that consent is a really contrary concept. What we found in research in Sweden that we did a few years ago, this demonstrates that we compared different incentive techniques ranging from just giving them a journey history map, which is basically no real incentive, through to actually give them a free power bank, a little battery, or giving them a discount on food, is that the incentives in the first instance, we approached 100 people and got them to buy into the project, 100 from each group, and we could see that it was much easier to attract participants who were incentivized, but at the end of the day, they didn't necessarily stay in the study and use the app for the longevity, for the duration of their travel. So incentives work in the first instance, but doesn't always mean that a tourist will be involved for the duration of the stay. If they get sick of it, they just delete it. The other thing, the contradiction that we have to play with when we're using Tracer is that while, many of us are happy to have apps on our phone that we've seen today that track us, if someone walks up to you and asks to track you, it's often a pretty offensive question to be asked. So there's this kind of like, we have this calculus that we make in our mind. And I think we often say yes if we get a kickback. And there's not a lot of people around who get a nice warm kickback from just doing research for the sake of research. So it's darn hard to recruit people using ethical techniques such as this. But I do believe that perhaps COVID has changed attitudes to tracking, and maybe we can use Tracer to track in the future. It does have potential to help. But the third question is around, you know, do we have technology fatigue? As time goes on and we're told to use this app, use that QR code to scan, put an app on to come into this state, you know, Tracer, it may get harder for us to use technology to track tourists. But at the same time, I believe that there's a lot to be gained from it. So that is my review of a few different techniques for you. Thank you very much for bearing with me for close to an hour. And I'd welcome any feedback or questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was pretty amazing and informative, and I always love hearing about Tracer. I do have some questions. If anyone has any questions, just put them in the chat, and I'll just read them out to Anne. So Marved Farhoudi said, amazing project. Is it targeting to record some aspects of tourism receipt aspects, i.e. amount spent by visitors in a local location?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We, at the moment, we are not actually, I'm going to stop my screen share. Sorry, I'll stop now. That's great. At the moment, we're not doing expenditure, but there is potential to do that, because I think that is one of the next thing for me that we just can't get is expenditure data. I mean, we can get it from Visa card and, you know, from bank companies in theory, but it's actually very hard for researchers to access that data. Large tourism organisations can afford to get it, but we can't. And there's also ethical considerations around accessing that data. So not yet, but I would love to be able to get tourism receipts to understand expenditure.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Allison Anderson asked, love hearing about all the methods of tracking. Do you have anything to say on the challenges of analyzing, cleaning, and presenting tracking data, especially tracer data? What skills are best for this?
Oh, thanks, Alison. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, this is a really interesting thing, and I could talk another hour about that. But to be very frank with you, so the analysing and the cleaning for us at the university is pretty simple, because we have guns like Martha in the room. So Martha has skills in GIS, and she also uses R. We have an algorithm to clean the data, so it excludes people who have, you know, only put the app on for 5 minutes and then walked away and taken it off. So we can do that. But one of the problems with the commercialization has been that that I guess when the commercialization agreement was made, and when organisations have bought the data or engaged with a provider to get the data, it's actually a real specialist skill having GIS and R skills as well. So the commercial license holder for Tracer can do a lot of automated presentation of the data, which is super cool, which you saw. But what it can't do is drill into those big details and do things like understanding dispersal, determining different things around special interest tourists. So yeah, what we are in a situation with is that we need to upskill our tourism organisations to deal with this data. Traditionally, tourism organisations hire people that have social research skills. We haven't traditionally hired people with GIS skills or R or those types of things in organisations, and they need that. So that's one of the challenges with this new method, is that industry organisations need to catch up and to be able to deal with it, or engage the university to assist with it. But yeah, GIS skills and advanced statistical skills are what are needed for it.
Awesome. And Linda Marion asked, would tour operators use this in the future of tourism?
I would love to see that they would use it. Yeah. I mean, I'm not, I haven't got my blinkers on. It's really, really hard because, as I mentioned before, a lot of people say no, they don't want to be tracked. But I do see it as a way to legitimize your company. If you can gently explain to people, look, say, for example, cruise companies, we want to return back to Alaska. But we know that this community that we're going to return back to is really nervous about where we're going to go and the possibility of our tourists spreading disease. So I see Tracer as a way to assist with legitimising the return of tourism in the future, because it allows tour operators to understand exactly where their tourists are going. They can then give that information to the destination. That explains to the destination how their tourists are using the destination, the impacts, and then if there's an outbreak, it would assist with being able to respond to outbreaks, because it tells you exactly where people have gone. So you can go, you need to go to this cafe, and that cafe, because that's where they've come into contact with people. So yes, it is possible they could use it.
Sorry, I had a little visitor.
Cute.
One to say, oh, hello. Oh, okay, honey. Does anybody else have any questions here for Anne and talking about Tracker or anything else that Anne has been working on? It is a fascinating subject. We do have time for one more question. If anybody has anything. I mean, you're pretty thorough and lots of info there.
I've got a question if no one else has.
All right.
Hey, thanks, Anne. That's fascinating research stuff. Got a question on the tracking. You did say, according to the GDPR, that you needed consent to have the data used. So how do you achieve the informed consent?
Through Tracer.
Okay, so it's all done through the app.
Sorry, I was just asking a question. Yeah. With Tracer, what we do is we have it on the app. So as soon as they download the app then says to them, we're doing research. It just reiterates we're doing research. We want to know where people go and how they're moving through destinations. And then we have pretty much the same as your standard ethics form. We have like a terms and conditions where they have to click to consent to it after we've provided the information for them. So it's all within the app.
Okay.
Yeah. And one of the big problems that we have, not so much with the consent at that point, is more with the changing nature of when tracking can actually occur, because Apple often wants to automatically turn the tracking off when the phone goes to sleep. So yeah, we have to explain to them really clearly about what we're doing and when the tracking might occur and what setting they want to put their phone, they should put their phone on so that we can track them. So we ask them to tick always. You know how you can say always or while using the app or never?
Or never.
Yeah. So yeah, we have to do it. We have to do it that way. And yeah, we have to be really, really upfront about it.
Thank you.
No worries.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne. Well, you've got a lot of,
thanks.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation that you could read through afterwards. It's always nice to see everyone's comments. I really appreciate your time on this and everybody else who's joined us today. And I'd like to just announce our next speaker. We are heading to New Zealand for our next presentation. On March 15th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to have Michael Luke from Auckland University of Technology, and he's going to talk about flippers and wings, the quest for sustainable marine wildlife. And Dr. Luke's research focuses on coastal marine and wildlife tourism, and he serves as the co-chair of the International Coastal and Marine Tourism Society. So thank you again, my lovely Anne, and everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much. I see there's lots of you from around the world, so we love seeing you, we love having you, and we love connecting. Please do check out our podcasts our blogs, and our previous speakers on this roster. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and have a lovely day or evening, depending on where you are in the world. Take care.